session. My name is Josiah Kimani. I'm co-founder of Informa East Africa. Today we're here hosting this event, co-hosting it with the Museum of British Colonialism. There are members from the museum who are here, and we have a range of volunteers as well. I normally like to introduce Olivia, but she's not here. She's always trying to help someone somewhere, but the kid is also from the museum. So yeah, there we go. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. Enjoy, engage, ask questions, write your notes, challenge the panel. That's why they're here. They have a lot of information that they will download, but equally, they also want to hear from the audience. So thank you very much. Mobile phones, please keep them to silent. You're welcome to take some photos. Oh, there's Olivia. Yes, look at her, she's running away. Enjoy the session. Nikita, over to you.
Great, thank you so much, and thank you all for being here today. It's been absolutely amazing to see the interest in every panel that has happened today. I was a bit worried. I was like, oh, Sunday 2 p.m, no one's going to turn up. But here you all are, so thank you all so much for coming. And thank you so much to the Museum of British Colonialism, who have organised this, and Informa East Africa. The Museum of British Colonialism is a volunteer-led and run organisation. They have put on the amazing exhibition downstairs about the Mau Mau emergency and the concentration camps. And if you haven't had a chance to look at it, please do so after this. And also, you know, these are great events. They take time and money, so, you know, as I mentioned, it's a volunteer-led and run organisation, so if you can, please do donate to the Museum of British Colonialism, because it's a really great project, and then we can do more events like this. So also thank you to the Informa East Africa, who have been co-hosting, and thank you as well to the Africa Centre for giving us this space today. It's been really great to be here. So our panel this afternoon is centred on the topic of reparations. Reparations has been a part of liberation movements all over the formerly enslaved or colonised world, and has formed an integral part of anti-colonial, anti-imperialist, pan-Africanist, civil rights and human rights movements. Whilst reparations are often discussed as a way to carry out justice for past wrongs, when it comes to the African colonial context, very few groups have had success following this path. Not for lack of trying, it's been the arguments that the former colonial powers regularly use is that, and especially the British government in this context, is that too much time has passed, and therefore today's government is not responsible for the crimes of the past. Reparations are therefore a tricky subject to handle, especially from a legal standpoint. Countries cannot be forced to pay reparations unless a court orders them to. And this often turns the issue of repayment into a technical legal argument rather than a moral one. There have been some successes. One such success has been, although I must point out importantly, it was settled out of court in order to not create a precedent, was the famous Mau Mau case of 2011. And one of our speakers here today, who was on the previous panel as well, he's really dedicated to the cause today, thank you so much for coming, is Professor Chege Githiora from SOAS. He was directly involved in the case, and we'll go into the details of that during the panel. There are other examples where it has been, apologies have been given, but there's not been much of a repayment of money, or, you know, something that is considered a classic reparation in that sense. And I'm thinking, especially, it's been mentioned a few times today, of the Namibia example, where the German government has officially recognised the killing of the Herero and Nama people as a genocide, although they've offered very little beyond symbolic apologies. And the German foreign minister actually argued that the word genocide is strictly a political and moral use of the word rather than a legal one. So again, we're dealing with that legal loophole and where the reparations start and end. Another topic with this is, some of you may have attended yesterday's panels, and I heard people were discussing it in the panel earlier today, on the question of repatriation of stolen objects. And we heard yesterday about the attempts in Zimbabwe to have skulls repatriated. And in Germany, as part of this apology for the Nama and Herero people, 71 skulls were repatriated to Namibia towards the end of last year. However, hundreds more skulls still remain in Berlin, hospitals and museums, and not just, it wasn't just Germany that was taking skulls out of Africa, and not just from Namibia, from East Africa, from West Africa, all over, as we heard in the Zimbabwean example. And you might be wondering why people were taking skulls out of Africa, and that was for pretty awful attempt at racial purity science to do tests on the skulls and so on. So unfortunately, in the Nama and Herero case, there have been attempts to make an apology, but beyond that, not much else. There is an ongoing case in New York, but again, it hasn't gotten very far. There are other contemporary examples, and they include another case from Kenya, for which we have two panelists here today. We have the governor of Kericho County, Governor Paul Chepkwony, and the lead lawyer on this case, who is Joel Kimutai Bosek. Full disclosure, I'm also involved in this case, so there's three of us. The case is an attempt to deal with mass land evictions that took place during the British colonial rule of fertile lands, which were then turned into the lucrative tea estates, of which most of the tea we drink today here in the UK comes from. Some of you may have been at David Olusoga's talk last night, where he spoke about tea, how the most British of drinks is not so British after all. And the team here are seeking reparations for the victims who were violently evicted from their ancestral lands to make way for the plantations. The team are also seeking a solution with regards to the multinationals which currently occupy and run the plantations. Multinationals such as Unilever and Finley's, Lipton, a lot of the tea that you all drink, have taken over the land, and they continue to exploit it and expand the tea plantations in various ways. So we'll discuss that a little later in the panel as well. And this is a good lead on to our fourth speaker, Mr. Tom Wills of Tradecraft Exchange. He does many things, including looking at what we could call current forms of British colonialism in Africa, in the sense of corporate land grabs. Most recently, he's been focusing on Liberia and speaking with communities who have had their land grabbed by a UK-listed palm oil company. Their crops were destroyed and protesters were beaten by Liberian police, as well as private security hired by the plantations. And the villagers who were promised so much before the palm oil company came in have been left without land, without their crops, and with no restitution for what was taken from them. And also without the promised benefits that they were supposed to have, such as employment on the palm plantations, schools, health clinics, and so on. Tradecraft Exchange and Tom, who's their senior policy advisor, I think, is that your correct title? Yes, good. Is working towards giving recommendations to the UK to legislate to prevent these corporate human rights abuses, and thus preventing a situation arising where further compensation claims need to be made in the future. So when preparing for this panel, it became very clear that the idea of a reparation is actually not so clear-cut. And I'm going to ask you as the audience to think about that throughout the session. What does it actually mean to have reparations for colonial crimes? How can we quantify the damage that was done? And how do we actually, how can we achieve justice for the victims of colonial crimes if the governments whom we are asking for this justice are not willing to even have these discussions? So that's something for us to think about, and it's definitely something I'd like to come to at the end in the discussion. But before diving in and asking our panelists to kind of give an explanation of where they're coming from today, I wanted to frame our panel with regards to the theme of this two-day conference that we've been having here today. And that is, as you may have seen on many of the posters, changing the narrative. So when it comes to reparations, I feel like this is key. One of the reasons the topic of reparations is so controversial and so hard to persuade former colonial governments to comply with is that it destroys the idea of the benevolent colonizers who came over to what they claimed were empty tracts of land, and in our case, African land, where the few people who were there had no culture, no society, they were in desperate need of British, French, German, Belgian, insert European country name, and thus the colonial project was justified. So if we think back to the repatriation of stolen objects, it kind of goes hand in hand with the issue of reparation, because how could a society which created the Benin bronzes or built the Great Zimbabwe be a society with no culture or a society which needed colonizing? The narrative which the colonial powers push through has no space for repatriation or reparation, and it is a narrative which, when we discuss the issue of reparations for colonial crimes, we have to work really hard to dismantle. I'm just going to read you very briefly the two opening paragraphs of an article that was written just in November last year, so 2019, in the Telegraph, talking about the claim in Kenya, and this is the opening paragraph. It seemed like a sensible way out of a spot of local bother, with a querulous clan of local mystics threatening the social order of Kenya's tea country back in the 1930s. The colony's British overlords thought they had hit on the obvious solution: deport the lot of them. Decades after the end of empire, that decision is now threatening to unleash Britain's gravest tea-related crisis, since a group of American bootleggers tipped chests of the stuff into Boston Harbour in 1773. So, I mean, that's November 2019, and the framing is maddening. So that's what we're up against when it comes to the narrative about colonialism. So thinking about this narrative today, as David Olusoga pointed out yesterday, there are plenty of people throughout Britain who want to create Empire 2.0, but they will be shocked to find out what formerly colonised people might think about them. The narrative today is also visible when we make comparisons with how aid and development is talked about. According to the official story, developing countries are poor because of their own internal problems, while Western countries are rich because they worked hard, and because the West happens to be further ahead. Its countries are generously reaching out to give aid to the rest. So this willingness to continue giving enormous amounts of money and aid, but not even consider a discussion on reparations, shows how successful the good colonial narrative has been and how embedded it has become in our day-to-day life. So the task which lies ahead of us is not a simple one. I'm not sure we will resolve it today, but we're slowly going somewhere, and so now seems as good a time as any to hand over to our panellists. I'm going to ask them to briefly describe their connection to the process of reparations, and then we'll ask a few questions, and then we'll open up to the audience. So thank you all for coming.
Thank you very much, Nikita. And once again, I would like to thank the organizers of this event, in particular those who are putting together the Museum of British Imperialism, for enabling us to get together here, because it is my pleasure to sit next to Professor Chenkone, Governor of Kericho. I'm also pleased to meet Bwana Kimutai, karibuni sana huku London, and of course Bwana Tom. I'm also pleased to meet you also in this context. It is not widely known that prior to Kenyan independence, during the so-called Mau Mau Rebellion, Britain perpetrated human rights abuses and war crimes on a vast scale. In the 1950s and the early 1960s, thousands of Kenyans were subjected to unspeakable acts of torture and abuse at the hands of British officials, including castrations, sexual abuse, repeated and repeated beatings. Many records indicate the appalling and systematic abuse and torture inflicted on the Kenyan people by the British colonial officers and the Kenyan Home Guards under British command. The claims refer back to 1952, when the colonial governor, Sir Evelyn Baring, declared a state of emergency in Kenya in an attempt to quash a mounting anti-colonial insurgency known as Mau Mau. Over the ensuing 8 years, an estimated 90,000 Kenyans were killed or injured. More than 1 million were forced from their homes into detention facilities, which Kenya's then Attorney General Eric Griffith Jones described as, I quote, distressingly reminiscent of conditions in Nazi Germany or communist Russia, end of quote. Some were Mau Mau rebels, of course, but many more were civilians caught in a dragnet of collective punishment. Collective punishment, as we shall also hear in the Kericho case, was a very common and typical British colonial way of making people bow to their demands. Now fast forward on April 4th, 2011, 5 elderly Kenyans, 3 men and 2 women, sat listening in court after having traveled 4,000 miles from rural Kenya to seek redress from the High Court in London. The treatment they endured in 1950s left them all with devastating and lifelong injuries, physical as well as emotional. They represented the wider community of thousands of elderly Kenyans who are still alive and who were subjected to systematic violence and abuse in colonial Kenya, which was sanctioned at the very highest level in London. In addition to providing translation and interpreting services for the lawyers and litigants, we, and here I must stress that I was not alone, far from that in this particular effort. Bonambaluto, right here, was very much involved in this particular case, and a few others who may not here be present. However, I'm sorry, I should also say Maxim Anderson was very much with us during the Mau Mau Justice Network campaign, which we organized, including a seminar at SOAS, with about 20 of those elders who accompanied the 5 delegates to London. We also screened a film called The Fifth Grader, which I would urge you to watch if you haven't, in order to sensitize and mobilize the London community during the hearing of the case. I also personally published a series of opinion articles in Kenyan and London newspapers. According to their lawyers and the members of the Kenyan National Human Rights Commission, these actions by the Kenyan London community and friends contributed to a positive outcome to the case, which was dubbed Mutua and others and Commonwealth Office, otherwise known as the Mau Mau case. On October 5th, 2012, the following decision was made. £19.9 million compensation shared between 5,000 victims of abuse during Mau Mau War, about £2,600 each, and very clearly put by the then Foreign Affairs, Secretary of Foreign Affairs, William Hague, the settlement was, and I quote, full and final. And these are important words because in legalistically speaking, that's very important. A statement to the House of Commons by William Hague, the then Foreign Secretary, expressed that the government, quote, sincerely regretted that these abuses took place, quite short of taking full responsibility. One more outcome was a memorial at Uhuru Park in Nairobi, paid for, sponsored by the British government, and unveiled in September 25th, 2015 by the High Commissioner of UK in Nairobi. Now, even though this first claim succeeded after a lengthy battle, the UK government appears determined to continue the defense against all accusations of colonial atrocity and demands for compensation, as has been outlined by Nikita, that it is too old, it is out of time, time barred, that is a common phrase they use. And therefore, a second legal claim by Mau Mau victims raised the case of a further 40,000 others, precisely 41,005 other litigants, led by the wife of the former freedom fighter, Dedan Kimathi. They filed a second lawsuit right here in London. They claimed that they were variously tortured, mistreated, and raped during the suppression. Simon Myerson, QC, who was instructed by Tandem Law on behalf of this group, each seeking damages of between £1,000 and £150,000. But this time around, and in this case, I was a sole interpreter, translator down here in Holborn at the Royal Court of Justice. But this time, the High Court refused to allow the larger Mau Mau case to proceed because it said the events had taken place too long ago for there to be a fair trial. I must say, personally, it was the most distressing 2 weeks of my life, translating tales of atrocities by elderly men and women who had traveled thousands of miles just to lay claim to facts that are everywhere in books and journals and elsewhere else, which, however, were repudiated by an aggressive lawyers on behalf of the government whose main task was to break down the credibility of these elderly victims. And I cannot forget the question they kept drilling into these old men and women. Are you sure you were beaten? Are you sure you were castrated by a man wearing a British Army hat? Well, in 1950s, any white person wearing a military uniform represented the colonial government, represented the UK, represented the British, and therefore it was a very, it's a technicality because the idea was if you were tortured by Kenya colonial government askari soldiers, then the UK government is not liable for your claim. Well, in sum, I would just say that the compensation meant a lot, even though it is a paltry sum. The exchange of funds was important. I personally am witness back home in the villages to elderly men and women building their first permanent stone and corrugated iron sheet houses of their life. I found a neighbor of mine who always lived in a thatched house. I had no idea that he had gone through what he had gone through. And I had no idea he was part of the 5,000 litigants. And I had no idea that the new house that he had built, I came to learn later, a nice little 2-bedroom house, was as a result of these £2,600 that they received. And therefore, the importance of that compensation, however little, cannot be gainsaid. It was also the first time for others to install electricity or running water in their homes or to buy essential medical supplies. So finally, all I would say is that the role of national governments is also important in pursuit of the reparations and compensation of colonial injustices. The Mau Mau case in London, for example, would not have taken place nor yielded the results it did had the 1952 ban on Mau Mau as a proscribed organization not been officially lifted in 2002 under the newly elected government of Kenya's third president, Mwai Kibaki. Without that stroke of the pen, the lawyers in Nairobi, all Martin Lay and Day here in London, would not have been able to file a case because technically that was an illegal organization. And therefore, policy is really important in getting these things done. Also, the diaspora plays an important role. Here as we are, our friends, Kenyans and Kenyan diaspora and friends and all Africans and Pan-Africanists who are in London, they play a big role because by sensitizing the British public, as we are doing now, is very, very important in order to bring these things to light. Finally, scholarship on the subjects, expertise is needed. Again, the Mau Mau case was heavily, or rather I should say, there was a great reliance on two experts, historian David Anderson and Professor Elkins of Harvard University, who had just then published the two books that you have seen downstairs maybe. David Anderson's Histories of the Hanged and Elkins' The British Gulag in Kenya in 1950s. Those books were used as evidence in court. So, with those two things, I just want to share this experience because I think it's quite relevant to what we are discussing here today. Thank you very much.
I'm now going to hand over to Professor Paul Chepkwony and the Governor of Kericho County. Oh, 3 microphones. And he's going to describe the current case.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Professor Paul Chepkwony, the governor of County 035, which is Kericho County. If you took your breakfast today, maybe you took English breakfast, Earl Grey, Twinings. We are the third largest producer of tea after India and Sri Lanka. And the leading multinational companies are based in Kericho. So as you take that tea, know that its home is Kericho County. I'm here as governor of Kericho, representing the people of Kericho, and on behalf of the 115,000 victims who have enlisted for the case. What has been my motivation and the motivation of the county government of Kericho? I am a victim. My father is a victim. My grandfather is a victim. My great-grandfather is a victim. The two are no longer here. They died while waiting for justice. But for you to understand, I will share historical perspective of this, so that you know the British declared Kenya as a protectorate between 1895 and 1920, when Kenya became a British colony. And by the time the present-day nation of Kenya was becoming a British colony, all the land had been alienated and taken away. And this, from my Mickey Mouse law, is illegal. It is unconstitutional. We were having the British as a protector. They should never have alienated land at that time. But my learned counsel will shed more light on that. And in 1905, they started proper alienation, where overall we lost 1 million acres of land. But from the strategic areas where there is tea now, and some other area which was good for keeping livestock, in 1905, 90,000 acres of land was taken away from the Talai and the Kipsigis, who are the predominant communities of Kericho. And these 90,000 acres were given to only 18 European settlers, only 18. You can look at the greed. In 1919, at the end of the First World War, another 25,000 acres were grabbed from the natives and given to the so-called British East Africa Disabled Officers Colony, BIDO. We had Africans who fought in the war, but they were never given anything. But here we are, having disabled soldiers from King's African rivals being given land in places they never even knew. And apparently, they were encouraged to grow a plant called flax as a commercial venture.